My MIL mocked me for being the family black sheep. She didn't know I owned her house. Oh look, everyone. The disappointment has arrived. Linda's voice cut through the warm chatter of Thanksgiving dinner like a rusty knife. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I stood in the doorway of her pristine dining room, still holding the bottle of wine I'd brought, a $200 Bordeaux that cost more than she spent on groceries in a week. My wife Sarah's face immediately flushed red. Mom, please. What? I'm just being honest. Linda's perfectly manicured fingers gestured dismissively in my direction. Look at him, Sarah. Ripped jeans to Thanksgiving dinner. No real job. 30 years old and still playing with houses like they're toy blocks. 28, actually, but who's counting? The extended family, Sarah's aunts, uncles, cousins, and their various offspring, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some stared at their plates. Others watched with barely concealed anticipation, like they were waiting for the next episode of their favorite drama to unfold. At least he's not in prison, muttered Uncle Bob from the head of the table, burning a few nervous chuckles. Yet, Linda added with a saccharine smile that made my jaw clench. This was classic Linda Morrison. Every family gathering for the past 4 years had included some variation of this performance. The woman had turned humiliating me into an art form. According to her, I was everything wrong with Sarah's life choices rolled into one disappointing package. I wasn't a lawyer like Sarah's ex-boyfriend Marcus, who Linda still brought up at least twice per visit. I didn't have an MBA from Wharton like cousin Timothy, who just bought his second BMW. I didn't even have a real job with a fancy title and business cards. What I had was a portfolio of 37 rental properties across 3 states, generating roughly $180,000 in monthly revenue. But Linda had decided 4 years ago that I was a deadbeat who bought and sold houses, which she said like I was dealing drugs, and no amount of evidence would convince her otherwise. Mom, Alex works very hard, Sarah said, her voice strained. She'd been fighting this battle since we got engaged, and I could see the exhaustion in her shoulders. Working hard at what, exactly? Linda's eyebrows arched dramatically. Convincing banks to loan him money he can't pay back. I've seen the news, Sarah. I know what happens to people who play games with real estate. The irony was suffocating. Linda Morrison, sitting in her perfectly decorated dining room, lecturing me about real estate and financial responsibility. The same Linda Morrison who'd taken out a second mortgage 3 years ago to fund her kitchen renovation. Who'd missed 4 payments last summer when her husband Jim's consulting business hit rough waters. Who'd been 67 days away from foreclosure when my LLC, Cornerstone Holdings, had purchased her house for $347,000. She had no idea she'd been paying rent to me for the past 14 months. Every month, like clockwork, Linda Morrison sent $2,800 to the property management company I'd hired specifically to handle her case. Every month, she complained to Sarah about her slumlord landlord who was probably some greedy corporation that doesn't care about families. If she only knew that her slumlord was currently standing in her dining room, being lectured about financial responsibility while wearing thrift store jeans and a Henley shirt that cost more than her monthly rent. Maybe we should just eat, I said quietly, setting the wine on her granite countertop, granite I technically owned. Linda's smile sharpened. Oh no, we're just getting started. You know what I was telling the Hendersons at the country club last week? Linda continued, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted maximum damage. I said, my daughter married a man who thinks he's Donald Trump, but he's really just a glorified house flipper who's going to lose everything when the market crashes. The wine bottle suddenly felt very heavy in my hands. Sarah's Aunt Carol made a small sound, whether from agreement or discomfort, I couldn't tell. Little Tommy, Sarah's 8-year-old nephew, was the only one still eating, blissfully unaware that his great-aunt was performing a public execution at the dinner table. Linda, Jim said quietly from his seat. Sarah's stepfather had always been the reasonable one, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd learned years ago that contradicting his wife in front of an audience was a losing battle. What, Jim? Someone needs to say it. Linda was warming up now, feeding off the awkward energy in the room. Sarah could have married Marcus. Remember Marcus, everyone? The partner at Whitfield and Associates. The one with the house in the Hamptons. Mom, I didn't want to marry Marcus, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course you didn't. You wanted to marry. Linda gestured at me like I was a particularly disappointing piece of furniture, this. A man who shows up to family dinner dressed like he's about to mow someone's lawn. A man who can't even afford a proper watch. I glanced down at my wrist. The Rolex Submariner I usually wore was sitting in my nightstand drawer at home. I'd deliberately chosen my beat-up Timex tonight, knowing that anything too expensive would trigger Linda's radar and lead to accusations about living beyond my means. Another irony for the pile. Tell me, Alex, Linda said, turning her full attention to me with the focus of a predator who'd spotted wounded prey, what exactly is your 5-year plan? Where do you see yourself when you're 35? Still flipping houses? Still dragging my daughter down with your get-rich-quick schemes? The room was completely silent now except for the soft clink of Tommy's fork against his plate. Sarah's face had gone from red to pale, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. This was the moment. The same moment that happened at every gathering, where Linda pushed and pushed until I had 2 choices, fight back and create a scene that would upset Sarah, or take it quietly and let her mother steamroll over me one more time. I'd chosen option 2 for 4 years running. 4 years of biting my tongue while Linda Morrison, who was literally my tenant, lectured me about financial responsibility and life choices. You know what I think? Linda continued, apparently taking my silence as permission to go for the kill shot. I think you're one of those men who preys on successful women. Sarah has a real career, real prospects, and you're just along for the ride. A financial leech. Financial leech. I thought about the $2,800 that would hit my account in 17 days when Linda paid her December rent. I thought about the new roof I'd had installed on this house last spring, $23,000 of my money to keep her comfortable. I thought about the property tax bill sitting in my office, $8,400 annually that Linda thought that mysterious corporation was paying. Sarah was staring at her plate now, and I could see a tear threatening to fall. Her cousin Michael was filming with his phone, probably posting this disaster to his Instagram story in real time. That's when Linda delivered the final blow. Honestly, Sarah, it's not too late. Marcus is recently divorced, you know. The tear that had been threatening finally rolled down Sarah's cheek, and something inside me snapped. Not the explosive kind of snap that makes you throw wine glasses or storm out dramatically. The quiet kind. The kind where suddenly all the careful calculations I've been making for 4 years, protecting Sarah's feelings, maintaining family peace, being the bigger person, just stopped mattering. Marcus is divorced? I asked, my voice perfectly calm. That's interesting timing. Linda's eyes lit up like she just hooked a fish. Very recent. His law firm is doing incredibly well. He just bought a place in Martha's Vineyard. Mom, stop, Sarah whispered, but Linda was on a roll now. Remember their vacation photos from Tuscany? That's the kind of life you could have had, sweetheart. Real security. Real success. She turned to address the table like a prosecutor making closing arguments. Instead, she's married to someone who probably doesn't even have a retirement account. I almost laughed at that one. My retirement account had hit $1.2 million last quarter, but Linda was right about one thing, I didn't have a traditional 401k. Hard to contribute to an employer plan when you own the company. You know what, Linda? I set down my fork and really looked at her for the first time in months. She was still beautiful at 54, in that high-maintenance way that required weekly salon appointments and personal trainers. The kind of beautiful that cost Jim about $4,000 a month to maintain, according to the financial documents I'd reviewed when I bought this house. What? She leaned forward slightly, sensing victory. I'm curious about something. You seem to know a lot about real estate markets and financial planning. Tell me, what's your take on the current rental market? Sarah's head snapped up. She knew that tone. That was my business voice, the one I used during negotiations. Linda waved her hand dismissively. Renters get taken advantage of by greedy landlords. It's disgusting, really. These big corporations swooping in, buying up family homes, charging whatever they want. I nodded thoughtfully. Speaking of which, how's your landlord treating you? Cornerstone Holdings, right? The question hung in the air like smoke. Linda's expression shifted slightly, confusion replacing confidence for just a moment. How did you? She caught herself. Fine. They're fine. Though they charged us a ridiculous pet deposit when we got muffins. She was referring to the small white dog currently sleeping by the fireplace. $200 for a 12-pound Yorkie. Highway robbery. I remembered that fee. I'd actually waived it initially, but my property manager had insisted on standard policies across all units. $200 does seem steep, I agreed. What's your monthly rent, if you don't mind me asking? I absolutely do mind you asking, Linda snapped, her territorial instincts kicking in. That's a very personal question. You're right, it is personal. Though I have to say, $2,800 seems fair for this neighborhood. Below market, actually. The confusion in Linda's eyes deepened. Jim had gone very still in his chair. Sarah was staring at me like I'd started speaking Mandarin. How could you possibly know? Lucky guess, I said, reaching for the wine I'd brought. The $200 Bordeaux that cost less than a day's rent on the house we were sitting in. You know, Linda, you keep talking about Marcus and his success. His house in Martha's Vineyard. But I'm curious, when's the last time Marcus paid your mortgage? The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't uncomfortable social tension. This was the moment before lightning strikes, when the air gets heavy and everything goes still. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Linda's voice had dropped to a whisper. I smiled and started opening the wine. Oh, I think you know exactly what it means. The color drained from Linda's face like someone had pulled a plug. Jim's fork clattered against his plate, and I could feel every person in that room lean forward without realizing it. I don't know what game you think you're playing, Linda said, but her voice had lost its earlier venom. Now she just sounded confused and slightly panicked. I took my time with the wine opener, letting the silence stretch. Sarah was gripping her napkin so hard her knuckles had gone white. She knew me well enough to recognize when I was building towards something big. No game, Linda. Just making conversation. I poured myself a generous glass of the Bordeaux and took a sip. This is good. You should try some. Though I suppose you're more of a box wine person these days. That hit home. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened. Mom, Sarah said quietly, maybe we should just. No. Linda's voice cracked like a whip. I want to know what your husband is implying. I set down my wine and pulled out my phone. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. A few swipes brought up the property management app one used to track all my rentals. For instance, it's a fact that Cornerstone Holdings purchased this property at 847 Maple Grove Drive on September 15, 2022, for $347,000. Linda's face went completely white. It's also a fact that the previous owners, James and Linda Morrison, were 67 days behind on their mortgage payments when Bank of America initiated foreclosure proceedings. Stop. The word came out as barely a whisper. But I was done being stopped. For years of being called a deadbeat, a leech, a disappointment, all while literally keeping a roof over this woman's head. Should I stop, Linda? Because you never seemed to want to stop before. I turned my phone screen toward her. The property management dashboard clearly showed her address, her monthly payment history, and her current balance. Paid in full through November 30th, December rent of $2,800 due in 17 days. Uncle Bob was leaning so far forward he was practically falling out of his chair. Sarah's cousin Michael had stopped recording and was just staring with his mouth open. You're lying, Linda said, but her voice had no conviction left. This is some kind of sick joke. Is it? I scrolled down to the tenant contact information. Should I call the number we have on file? I believe it's 555-0147. That's your cell phone, right, Linda? The one you used when you called our maintenance line 3 times last month about the garbage disposal? Jim stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floors. Alex, I think we need to talk privately. Oh, I think this is plenty private, I said, gesturing around the table. After all, Linda never had a problem discussing my financial situation in front of everyone. Seems only fair. Sarah was crying now, but I couldn't tell if it was from embarrassment, anger, or something else entirely. How? Linda's voice was barely audible. How is this possible? You want the whole story? I leaned back in my chair, in my house. Cornerstone Holdings LLC was incorporated in Delaware in March 2019. I'm the sole member and managing partner. We specialize in distressed properties with good bones in decent neighborhoods. Properties where families are struggling but the fundamentals are sound. I took another sip of wine, savoring both the vintage and the moment. When your house hit the foreclosure listings, my partner ran the numbers. Solid neighborhood, recent renovations, below market pricing due to the circumstances. It was a good investment. I paused. Of course, I had no idea it was your house until after we'd closed. Property purchases through LLCs can be very anonymous that way. You knew, Linda accused, but without her usual fire. You had to know. I found out exactly 14 months and 6 days ago, when I got a call from my property manager asking what to do about a tenant who was 3 days late on rent and claiming her deadbeat son-in-law had made her forget to pay on time. The admission hit the table like a bomb. The silence that followed was deafening. Even little Tommy had stopped eating, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth as he stared at the adults with wide, confused eyes. 14 months, Linda repeated, her voice hollow. You've known for 14 months. 14 months and 6 days, I corrected. I remember the exact date because I had to decide what to do about it. My property manager, Janet, wanted to know if we should proceed with standard late fee policies or if there were any special circumstances she should be aware of. Jim sank back into his chair, his face gray. Jesus Christ, Alex. What did you tell her? Sarah asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, and I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to process what this meant for our marriage, for her family, for everything. I told her to waive the late fee. First time occurrence, good tenant otherwise. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the deep red catch the light from Linda's chandelier. I also told her that any future communications regarding 847 Maple Grove should come directly to me, not through the standard channels. You lying piece of shit, Linda snarled, some of her fight returning. This is fraud. This is illegal. You can't just. Actually, I can. I pulled up another screen on my phone. Everything was handled through proper legal channels. The foreclosure was legitimate, the sale was processed through standard procedures, and all tenant agreements were established according to state housing laws. Your lease is ironclad, Linda. Janet made sure of that. Uncle Bob cleared his throat. So you've been her landlord this whole time. While she's been calling me a deadbeat? A financial leech? Someone who preys on successful women? I nodded. Every family dinner. Every birthday party. Every Christmas morning where she made sure to mention how worried she was about Sarah's future financial security. Aunt Carol made a choking sound that might have been laughter or horror. The roof, Jim said suddenly, his voice hollow with realization. The new roof last spring. That was you. $23,468, I confirmed. The original estimate was $26, but I found a better contractor. Seemed foolish to overpay when it's my property. Linda's perfectly manicured hands were shaking now. All this time, you sat there while you what, Linda? While you humiliated me in front of your family? While you told everyone I was irresponsible and immature? While you suggested my wife should leave me for her ex-boyfriend? I set my phone on the table, screen up, the property management dashboard still visible. I sat there and took it because Sarah asked me to. Because keeping the peace was more important than my pride. But not anymore, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. I looked at my wife, really looked at her. The woman I'd fallen in love with 6 years ago, who defended me against her mother's attacks for 4 years, who'd cried herself to sleep more than once after these family gatherings because she was caught between the two people she loved most. I don't know, I said honestly. What do you think, honey? Should I keep letting your mother lecture me about financial responsibility while she pays me $2,800 a month in rent? Should I keep pretending to be the family failure while I bankroll her lifestyle? Linda shot to her feet, her chair toppling backward. You arrogant son of a bitch. You think you're so clever, don't you? Setting me up, humiliating me in front of my family. I didn't set you up, Linda. You set yourself up. I stood as well, and suddenly the dynamic in the room shifted completely. I've been subsidizing your rent for over a year. Market rate for this house is $3,400 minimum. I've been charging you $2,800 because Janet said that's what you could afford based on Jim's income. The number hit like a physical blow. Jim's consulting business was struggling worse than I'd thought if they couldn't handle market rent. $3,400. Jim's voice cracked. Minimum. Probably closer to 38 with the new roof and the kitchen upgrades. I gestured around Linda's perfect dining room. The Hendersons at your country club. The ones you were telling about my get-rich-quick schemes. I own their rental property too. Small world. The revelation about the Hendersons hit the table like a second earthquake. Linda's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, while Uncle Bob let out a low whistle that cut through the silence. The Hendersons, Linda repeated, her voice barely functional. You own, but they said their landlord was some faceless corporation from Chicago. Midwest Property Solutions LLC. Incorporated in Illinois, managed through a third-party company in Chicago. I couldn't help the slight smile that tugged at my lips. The Hendersons are actually great tenants. Always pay on time, take care of the property. Unlike some people, they don't spend their time at country clubs bad-mouthing their landlord's family. Sarah's cousin Michael had gone completely pale. Wait, Mom, he said to Aunt Carol, didn't the Hendersons tell you about their landlord raising the rent last month? The color drained from Carol's face as she realized where this was headed. Raised it from $2,900 to $3,150, I confirmed, consulting my phone again. Still below market, but they'd been at the same rate for 18 months. Even gave them 60 days notice instead of the required 30. Linda grabbed the back of Jim's chair for support. How many? She whispered. How many properties do you own in our neighborhood? I pretended to count, though I knew the exact number. In Willowbrook specifically. 7. Though if we're talking about the greater metro area. I shrugged. Let's just say when you told the Pattersons at Sarah's birthday that I was probably going to end up bankrupt like all those house flippers on TV, you were talking to 2 of my tenants. The room erupted in chaos. The Pattersons too? Carol gasped. Jesus, Alex, how much money do you actually have? This from Uncle Bob, who was staring at me like I'd just revealed I was secretly Batman. Mom, you have to stop talking about Alex at the country club, Sarah said, her voice stronger now, though I could see she was still processing everything. You're literally gossiping about your landlord to his other tenants. But Linda wasn't done. The humiliation was transforming into something more dangerous, desperate anger. This is sick, she hissed. You've been playing some kind of twisted game with us. Pretending to be poor while you. She gestured wildly around her own dining room. This is psychological abuse. Psychological abuse. The accusation hit harder than I expected. Linda, I've kept you in your home for over a year at below market rent. I fixed your roof, your plumbing, your furnace last winter. When you called the maintenance line screaming about the broken dishwasher on Christmas Eve, I had someone there within 2 hours. You knew, she shouted. You knew it was me calling. Of course I knew. Janet forwards me all communications regarding your property. I pulled up another screen. Would you like to hear some of your greatest hits? December 23rd, 11:47 p.m. This is Linda Morrison and my dishwasher is leaking everywhere and if someone doesn't fix this immediately I'm calling my lawyer. Or how about January 15th, the heat isn't working properly and I demand someone come out here right now. I'm not paying rent to live in an icebox. Jim buried his face in his hands. Linda, please stop. January 28th was my personal favorite, I continued, my voice growing colder. I'm sick of dealing with this incompetent management company. Your landlord is probably some greedy slumlord who doesn't care about families. I have rights as a tenant. Each quote landed like a physical blow. Linda's face cycled through shades of red and white as the full scope of her situation became clear. Every complaint, every demand, every time you called my property manager an idiot, it all came directly to my email within an hour. Stop, Sarah said quietly, but I was past stopping. The best part? You always ended those calls by complaining about your deadbeat son-in-law to whoever answered the phone. Poor Janet got to hear about my lack of ambition at least twice a month. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't shock anymore, this was the moment when everyone realized that 4 years of family dynamics had been built on a lie, and nobody knew what came next. So what now? Linda asked, her voice small and defeated. You're going to evict us? Raise our rent? Get your revenge? I looked around the table at Sarah's family, my family, technically, and felt the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders. That depends, I said slowly, on whether you're finally ready to have an honest conversation. The word honest seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Linda stared at me across her dining room table, my dining room table, and I could see her mind working, calculating what honesty might cost her. Honest, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. You want to talk about honest? You've been lying to us for over a year. I've never lied to you once, Linda. I pulled up my contacts and scrolled to Janet's number. Every question you've asked about my work, my income, my plans, I've either told you the truth or stayed silent. There's a difference. Sarah leaned forward, her lawyer instincts finally kicking in. Alex, when exactly did you find out it was Mom's house? The question I've been dreading. Because this was where my moral high ground got a little shaky. October 12, 2022. 27 days after we closed on the property. I met Sarah's eyes directly. Janet called me about the late rent and mentioned the tenant's name in passing. I recognized the address immediately. 27 days, Sarah repeated slowly. So you knew before Mom's birthday party where she told everyone I'd probably be bankrupt by Christmas? Yes. I knew then. The birthday party had been particularly brutal. Linda had cornered Sarah's college friends, explaining how worried she was about her daughter's financial future with someone so unstable. She'd actually used the word unstable to describe me while standing in a house I owned. Jim cleared his throat. The maintenance requests. You said you handle them personally now. How personally? I almost smiled at that. Remember when your garbage disposal started making that grinding noise in February? You called on a Tuesday evening, frustrated because the management company said the earliest they could get someone out was Friday. His face went pale. The repair guy showed up Wednesday morning. I called him myself that night. Paid him double his normal rate to squeeze you in. I took another sip of wine. You told Linda that maybe your landlord wasn't such a slumlord after all. She said, and I quote, "Don't be naive, Jim. Rich people don't stay rich by being nice to tenants." The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. How much? Linda asked suddenly. How much are we talking about here? Your real income, not whatever story you've been telling Sarah. Sarah's head snapped toward her mother. Mom, that's completely inappropriate. No, it's fine, I interrupted. She's going to find out anyway. I pulled up my banking app, navigating to the summary screen. Last year's gross income from rental properties was just over $2.1 million. Net income after expenses, taxes, and reinvestment was roughly $840,000. The number hit the table like a bomb. Uncle Bob choked on his wine. Cousin Timothy, the one with the Wharton MBA and 2 BMWs, made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. Even little Tommy looked up from his plate, sensing the shift in adult energy. That's impossible, Linda whispered. The beauty of real estate, I said, is that it's all public record. Anyone can look up property ownership, sale prices, tax assessments. You just have to know where to look. Sarah was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Alex, why didn't you ever tell me the actual numbers? Because you never asked. I reached over and took her hand. You knew I did well. You knew we were comfortable. But your mother spent 4 years telling you I was going to drag you down financially. I figured specific numbers would just give her more ammunition. More ammunition for what? Linda demanded. For convincing Sarah she'd married beneath herself. The words came out sharper than I intended. For suggesting she'd be better off with Marcus and his house in Martha's Vineyard. For making her feel embarrassed about her choice in husband every time we walked into a family gathering. Linda's mouth opened to argue, but Jim cut her off. She's right, you know, he said quietly, not looking at his wife. About the ammunition. Linda, you've been relentless. The admission from her own husband seemed to break something in Linda's carefully constructed facade. For the first time in 4 years, she looked genuinely vulnerable instead of just angry. I was protecting her, she whispered. From what? I asked. From financial security. From someone who loves her. From a man who's been subsidizing your rent for over a year while you publicly humiliated him. The last question hung in the air as Linda Morrison finally realized she'd been attacking her own safety net. Protecting me from what, exactly? Sarah's voice cut through the silence, and I could hear 4 years of suppressed frustration finally breaking free. From someone who's been quietly paying for your roof repairs while you told everyone he was a deadbeat? Linda's face crumpled, but Sarah wasn't done. Do you have any idea how many nights I've cried because of your comments? How many times I've defended Alex while secretly wondering if you were right? Sarah's voice was shaking now. I've been carrying around this guilt for years, thinking I disappointed you by not marrying someone successful enough. Sarah, honey, Linda started, but her daughter cut her off. $800,000, Mom. Net income. Do you know what Marcus made as a junior partner last year? $160,000. Before taxes. The comparison hit Linda like a physical blow. I could see her mentally recalculating 4 years of assumptions, 4 years of public commentary about her daughter's poor life choices. But he had stability, Linda said weakly. A law degree, a respectable career. He also had a cocaine habit and a gambling problem, Sarah snapped. Which is why he's divorced and why his law firm is doing incredibly well without him. He was forced out, Mom. 6 months ago. I heard it through the legal gossip network, but I didn't want to embarrass you since you keep bringing him up. Uncle Bob let out a low whistle. Cocaine habit. 40,000 in debt to some very unpleasant people, last I heard, Sarah continued. So yes, Mom, you're absolutely right. I should have married the drug addict with gambling debts instead of the millionaire real estate investor who's been keeping you housed for over a year. The sarcasm in Sarah's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. I'd never heard her talk to her mother like this, and from Linda's expression, neither had anyone else. I didn't know, Linda whispered. About Marcus, about any of it. Because you never asked. Sarah's voice rose. You just decided Alex wasn't good enough based on his clothes and his age, and you've spent 4 years trying to convince me I made a mistake. Cousin Michael, who'd been silent since putting away his phone, finally spoke up. Aunt Linda, remember last Christmas when you told everyone Alex probably couldn't even afford to buy you a proper gift? I almost laughed, remembering that conversation. Linda had opened my gift, a set of professional-grade kitchen knives she'd been wanting, and commented loudly that they were probably from Target and typical of someone who doesn't understand quality. Those knives were handmade in Germany, I said quietly. They cost $1,200. I had them custom engraved with your initials. Linda's face went white as she probably remembered donating those knives to Goodwill 3 months later, complaining to Sarah that they were too fancy for everyday use. You threw them away, Sarah said, her voice hollow with realization. You donated them. I saw them in the donation pile. I thought they were cheap knockoffs, Linda whispered. Everything Alex has ever given you, you've either returned, donated, or complained about, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. The wine tonight. Probably costs more than you spend on groceries in a month. The flowers he brought for Mother's Day. You told everyone they were grocery store quality, they were from Bella Flora, Mom. $40 a stem. Jim was shaking his head slowly. Linda, what have you done? The question seemed to break whatever was left of Linda's defenses. She sank back into her chair, her perfectly styled hair falling across her face as the full weight of 4 years of mistakes crashed down on her. I was trying to protect you, she repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to her. No, I said firmly. You were trying to control her. There's a difference. The distinction hung in the air as Linda Morrison finally confronted the truth she'd been avoiding for 4 years. She'd been wrong about everything. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally burned itself out. Linda stared at her hands, her perfectly manicured nails suddenly seeming garish under the dining room lights. For the first time since I've known her, she looked genuinely small. I need to ask you something, I said, keeping my voice level. And I need an honest answer. Linda looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but wary. The foreclosure. How close were you really to losing everything? Jim answered instead, his voice barely audible. 96 days. Jim, Linda warned, but he shook his head. No, Linda. No more hiding. He looked directly at me. We were 96 days past due when the bank started proceedings. My business had 3 clients cancel in the same month, and Linda's part-time job at the gallery barely covered groceries. Sarah's intake of breath was sharp. Mom, you told me you were just restructuring your mortgage. You said it was a strategic financial move. We were going to lose everything, Linda whispered. The house, our credit, everything. I was working at Nordstrom part-time just to keep the lights on, and Jim was. Jim was talking about bankruptcy. The revelation hit the table like a thunderclap. Uncle Bob set down his wine glass with trembling fingers. Cousin Timothy, who'd spent the last hour looking shell-shocked, finally found his voice. Aunt Linda, when you told everyone at Christmas that financial planning was just common sense. I know. Linda's voice cracked. I know how that sounds now. I pulled up another screen on my phone, scrolling through the financial documents from the foreclosure sale. You owed $412,000 on a house worth $347. You were underwater by $65,000, and the missed payments meant you were looking at penalties that would have pushed the total debt over $450. The numbers were clinical, but their impact was devastating. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, finally understanding how close her parents had come to financial ruin. When Cornerstone Holdings bought the property, I continued, the bank wrote off the difference as a loss. You walked away from $65,000 in negative equity without filing bankruptcy. Do you understand what that means? Linda nodded slowly, tears starting to flow. You saved us. I bought a property at market value, I corrected. What saved you was my decision to charge below market rent and not check the credit history too carefully when Janet processed your tenant application. Jim's head shot up. Our credit was completely destroyed. A 480 credit score, 6 missed mortgage payments, and 2 maxed out credit cards. I set my phone down. Janet wanted to require a cosigner and charge market rent of $3,400. I overruled her. The silence that followed was deafening. Even little Tommy had stopped eating, sensing the gravity of what the adults were discussing. Why? Linda asked, her voice barely a whisper. After everything I said about you, everything I did, why would you help us? The question I'd been asking myself for 14 months. Why had I kept quiet? Why had I absorbed the insults while literally keeping their lives stable? Because Sarah loves you, I said simply. And because despite everything you've put me through, watching you lose your home wouldn't have made me feel better. It would have made me feel like exactly the kind of person you always said I was. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand, tears streaming down her face. Besides, I added, trying to lighten the moment, you're actually good tenants when you're not complaining about your landlord. You keep the property in excellent condition, and until this conversation, you'd only been late with rent once. Linda let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. This is insane. This whole situation is completely insane. It is, I agreed. But it's also reality. So now we need to figure out what comes next. The question of what comes next hung over the table like a sword. Linda dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, smearing her carefully applied mascara. Jim stared at his untouched plate. Sarah's grip on my hand had become almost painful. There's something else, I said, pulling up my email app. Something you all need to know before we decide anything. Linda's face went pale again. What now? 3 weeks ago, I got an offer on this property. Cash buyer, no inspection needed. $42,000 over what I paid for it. The number hit Jim like a physical blow. Jesus, Alex. That's nearly $100,000 profit in 14 months. $91,732, to be exact. After closing costs and my initial repairs. I scrolled through the email chain with my real estate agent. Developer wants to tear down the house and build 2 modern townhomes. Already has permits approved. Sarah's face went white. You're selling. I was considering it, I admitted. Before tonight. The numbers made sense, and honestly, listening to Linda complain about her slumlord every month was getting old. Uncle Bob leaned forward. Was considering. The offer expires December 15th. 22 days from now. I looked directly at Linda. I've been sitting on it because I couldn't decide if keeping you housed was worth the financial and emotional cost. Linda made a strangled sound. You've been planning to evict us. Not evict. Sell. Big difference. The new owner would have to honor your existing lease, but at market rates. $3,400 minimum, probably more given the development pressure in this area. Jim's calculator brain was clearly working overtime. That's an extra $600 a month we can't afford. Which brings us to an interesting crossroads, I continued, setting my phone face down on the table. I can accept the offer and walk away with a substantial profit. You can deal with new landlords who won't give you the family discount. Clean break for everyone. Or. Sarah asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the alternative. Or we have the honest conversation Linda mentioned. About respect, about family, about what it means to treat people decently even when you think they're beneath you. Linda flinched at the last part, but she didn't argue. What kind of conversation? Jim asked carefully. The kind where Linda stops telling everyone at the country club that I'm a deadbeat. The kind where she stops suggesting Sarah would be better off with someone else. The kind where we acknowledge that I've been part of this family for 4 years, and maybe it's time to start acting like it. Cousin Michael cleared his throat. What about the other properties? The Hendersons, the Pattersons? What about them? Are you going to tell them? About Aunt Linda talking about you at the club? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't really considered the social implications beyond this table. Linda's face went ashen as she realized her reputation with the neighbors was now in my hands. That depends, I said slowly, on whether Linda can learn to keep family business in the family. This is blackmail, Linda whispered, but there was no fire in it. Just exhaustion. No, Linda. Blackmail would be threatening to evict you unless you publicly apologize and worship the ground I walk on. This is me offering you a choice. I picked up my wine glass, noting that my hands were surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Respect or profit? Your call. The ultimatum hung in the air as 23 pairs of eyes waited to see what Linda Morrison would choose. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Linda stared at the table, her breathing shallow and uneven. I could see the calculations running through her head, the math of pride versus survival, the weight of 4 years of cruelty balanced against the reality of her situation. There's more, Jim said suddenly, his voice hollow. Linda, tell him about the medical bills. Jim, don't. No, he needs to know. If we're having an honest conversation, he needs to know everything. Jim looked directly at me, his face gray with exhaustion. Linda was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer in March. The treatments, the specialists, the time off work, we're looking at about $38,000 in out-of-pocket costs over the next 2 years. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mom, you didn't tell me. Because I didn't want you to worry, Linda said sharply, then her voice cracked. And because I was ashamed. After everything I said about your husband, about financial responsibility. I couldn't admit that we were drowning. I set down my wine glass, my mind reeling. Suddenly Linda's increased hostility over the past few months made horrible sense. The woman had been fighting cancer while struggling to keep her family afloat financially, all while attacking the one person who was actually keeping her housed. The insurance covered most of it, Jim continued, but the deductibles, the co-pays for specialists, the experimental treatments insurance won't touch. We've been using credit cards just to keep up. Uncle Bob's face had gone pale. Linda, honey, why didn't you ask for help? From who? Linda's laugh was bitter. From you and Carol. You're still paying off Timothy's student loans. From my sister in Phoenix. She's got her own problems. She gestured around the table. From my extended family who thinks I've got everything figured out because I live in a nice house and belong to the country club. The irony was suffocating. The country club membership she'd been using to humiliate me was probably bleeding them dry financially. How much is the country club costing you monthly? I asked quietly. That's not, Linda started, but Jim cut her off. $460. Plus dining minimums, cart fees, social events. He rubbed his face with both hands. We should have canceled it months ago, but Linda said we couldn't afford to look like we were struggling. Because appearances matter, Linda whispered. Because if people knew we were in trouble, if they knew I was sick, if they knew we lost our house. She trailed off, staring at her reflection in the wine glass. Sarah was crying openly now. Mom, I would have helped. Alex would have helped. We could have. With what? Your husband's imaginary real estate money. Linda's voice turned sharp again, then immediately softened as she realized what she just said. God, I'm such an idiot. No, I said firmly. You're not an idiot. You're proud, and you're scared, and you've been dealing with more than anyone should have to handle alone. Linda looked up at me, confusion and something that might have been hope flickering in her eyes. But here's what I don't understand, I continued, leaning forward. If you've been this desperate for money, this worried about financial security, why spend 4 years trying to convince your daughter to leave someone who could actually help you? The question hung in the air like a challenge, waiting for Linda Morrison to finally confront the self-destructive logic that had nearly cost her everything. The question seemed to break something fundamental in Linda's carefully constructed worldview. She stared at me for a long moment, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find words that didn't exist. Because I was terrified, she finally whispered. Because successful people don't stay successful by being generous to their in-laws. Because I thought if you really had money, you'd eventually figure out that Sarah could do better, and you'd leave her for someone from your own social class. The admission was so raw, so unexpectedly vulnerable, that it caught everyone off guard. Even little Tommy seemed to sense the shift, setting down his fork and looking between the adults with wide, serious eyes. You thought I'd leave Sarah because she wasn't rich enough? I asked, genuinely confused. Rich men don't marry middle-class women for love, Linda said, her voice barely audible. They marry them for convenience, or rebellion, or because they're slumming. And when they get bored, they trade up. Sarah's face crumpled. Mom, that's horrible. That's reality, sweetheart. Or at least, that's what I thought was reality. Linda wiped her eyes with her napkin, leaving dark streaks of mascara. My father left my mother for his secretary when I was 12. She had money, came from the right family. Left us with nothing but debt and a mortgage we couldn't pay. Uncle Bob shifted uncomfortably. Linda, you never told us. Because it was humiliating. Because I spent my entire adult life trying to build the kind of security that couldn't be taken away by some man's wandering eye. Linda's voice grew stronger, more focused. When Sarah brought you home, wearing your thrift store clothes and talking about investing in real estate, all I could think was, here we go again. The pieces were finally clicking into place. Linda hadn't been protecting Sarah from financial instability, she'd been protecting her from the kind of abandonment that had destroyed her own childhood. So you tried to drive me away first, I said, understanding flooding through me. Better to end it on your terms than wait for me to leave when someone better came along. Except I was doing it by attacking the very thing that made you a good catch, Jim added, his voice heavy with realization. Jesus, Linda. You've been sabotaging our own safety net for 4 years. Linda buried her face in her hands. I know. God help me, I know. Aunt Carol leaned forward, her voice gentle. Honey, what did you think was going to happen? Even if Alex had been struggling financially, what was the endgame? I thought Sarah would see sense. I thought she'd realize she deserved better and find someone stable, someone from a good family, someone who wouldn't disappear when things got complicated. Linda's voice was muffled by her hands. Someone like Marcus used to be, before. Before the cocaine and gambling debts, Sarah said flatly. I didn't know about that, Linda protested weakly. He seemed so stable, so established. He seemed like what you wanted him to seem like, I corrected. Just like I seemed like what you expected me to be, a deadbeat with big dreams and no follow-through. Linda dropped her hands and looked at me directly for the first time all evening. You could still leave. Now that everything's out in the open, now that you know how badly I've treated you. You could take your profit and walk away from all of us. I could, I agreed. $91,000 is a lot of money, even for me. And dealing with difficult tenants is always a headache. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened painfully. But here's the thing, Linda, I continued, pulling out my phone one more time. I pulled your credit report yesterday when I was deciding about the sale. Want to know what I found? Linda's face went white again. Please don't. 0 missed payments to Cornerstone Holdings. 14 months of rent paid on time, despite medical bills, despite Jim's business struggles, despite everything you've been dealing with. I set the phone down. You prioritized keeping a roof over your head above everything else, including your pride. That tells me something important about who you really are when the chips are down. What does it tell you? Linda asked, her voice barely a whisper. That maybe it's time we all stopped pretending to be people we're not. The weight of my words settled over the table like dust after an explosion. Linda stared at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before, not hope, exactly, but maybe the possibility of it. What are you saying? She asked carefully. I took a long sip of wine, buying time to organize my thoughts. The truth was, I'd been planning this conversation for weeks, but actually living through it felt completely different from rehearsing it in my head. I'm saying that respect is a two-way street, Linda. You want me to understand your fears about Sarah's financial security? Then you need to understand that I've been subsidizing your life while you publicly humiliated me for sport. Sarah squeezed my hand. Alex. No, let me finish. I looked around the table at faces ranging from shocked to guilty to fascinated. Here's what's going to happen. I'm declining the developer's offer. Jim's relief was visible, his shoulders sagging like a weight had been lifted. But, I continued, holding up a finger, things are going to change. Dramatically. Linda's momentary relief evaporated. What kind of changes? I pulled up my property management app again, scrolling to Linda's account. First, your rent is going up to market rate. $3,400 a month, starting February 1st. That gives you 2 months to adjust your budget. We can't afford, Jim started, but I held up my hand. Second, you're canceling the country club membership immediately. That's $460 a month you're wasting on appearances while struggling to pay medical bills. Linda's face flushed red. You can't dictate how we spend our money. You're right, I can't. But I can choose whether to offer below-market rent to tenants who use their savings to badmouth me at social events. I met her eyes directly. Your choice, Linda. Financial priorities or social status. Pick one. Uncle Bob cleared his throat uncomfortably. Alex, maybe that's a little harsh. Is it? I turned to him. Bob, what would you do if someone spent 4 years telling everyone at their club that you were a deadbeat, while you were literally paying their rent? Bob's mouth opened, then closed. No argument there. Third, I continued, turning back to Linda, we're going to have a family meeting. Sarah, you, me, and Jim. No extended family, no audience, no performance. We're going to discuss boundaries, expectations, and what it actually means to be part of this family. Sarah nodded slowly. That sounds reasonable. And fourth, I said, consulting my notes app where I've been planning this for weeks, Linda, you're going to call Janet tomorrow morning and apologize for your behavior during maintenance calls. Not because I'm forcing you to, but because treating service people poorly reflects on your character, not mine. Linda's face went through several color changes. You want me to apologize to your property manager? I want you to apologize to Janet Chen, a single mother of two who's been doing her job professionally while you screamed at her about broken appliances. My voice got colder. She doesn't know you're my mother-in-law, Linda. She just knows you as the tenant who calls her incompetent when your garbage disposal makes noise. The shame on Linda's face was almost painful to watch. Jim reached over and put his hand on her shoulder. There's one more thing, I said, pulling up my banking app. The medical bills. 38,000, you said. Alex, no, Sarah said immediately. You can't just. I can, actually. But I won't. I looked directly at Linda. Not unless you ask me. Directly, honestly, without games or manipulation. If you need help, Linda, you ask for it like an adult. No more martyrdom, no more suffering in silence while taking your frustration out on me. Linda stared at her hands, tears starting again. I don't know how to ask for help. Then learn, I said simply. Because your daughter loves you, and despite everything, I don't actually want to see you struggle. But I'm done being your emotional punching bag while I solve your problems behind the scenes. The ultimatum hung in the air, waiting for Linda Morrison to decide who she wanted to be going forward. The silence that followed my ultimatum stretched until it became almost unbearable. Linda's breathing was shallow, her hands trembling as she gripped her napkin. I could see the war playing out across her face, pride battling necessity, fear wrestling with hope. Then my phone rang. The sharp buzzing cut through the tension like a knife. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach drop. Janet Chen, my property manager. At 8:47 p.m. on Thanksgiving night. I need to take this, I said, stepping away from the table. Janet? What's wrong? Alex, I'm so sorry to call tonight, but we have an emergency at 8:47, Maple Grove. Janet's voice was tight with stress. The neighbors called about water pouring out from under the front door. I'm here now with emergency maintenance, and it's bad. My blood went cold. I could hear water running in the background, and what sounded like Janet shouting instructions to someone. How bad? Burst pipe in the main bathroom. Looks like it's been going for at least an hour. The hardwood floors in the living room and dining room are completely flooded. Water's reached the kitchen, and it's starting to seep into the basement. I closed my eyes, calculating damage estimates. Hardwood floor replacement, drywall repairs, potential mold remediation, we were looking at 40 to 60,000 in repairs, minimum. Janet, I need you to shut off the main water line immediately. Then call ServiceMaster for emergency water extraction. I don't care what it costs tonight. Already done on both counts. But Alex, the tenants aren't here. The house is completely empty. I'm wondering if they went out for the holiday and didn't notice the leak starting. I turned back toward the dining room, where Linda was staring at me with growing concern. She'd heard enough of the conversation to know something was wrong. They're here, Janet. Having dinner with family. I'll handle notifying them. Oh God, Alex. On Thanksgiving night. These poor people are about to come home to a disaster. The irony was almost laughable. Janet was expressing sympathy for tenants who'd spent months calling her incompetent, while I was standing in their dining room having just delivered an ultimatum about respect and responsibility. Do what you can tonight, Janet. I'll be there within the hour to assess the damage personally. I hung up and walked back to the table, where every face was turned toward me with varying degrees of concern and curiosity. Linda, Jim, I said carefully, you need to know that your house just sustained major flood damage. Burst pipe in the main bathroom. My emergency team is there now, but you're looking at several weeks of repairs before the property is habitable. Linda's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against her plate. What does that mean? Where are we supposed to go? Most landlords would put you in temporary housing while repairs are completed. Extended stay hotel, usually. But given the extent of the damage Janet described, we're talking 6 to 8 weeks minimum. Jim's face had gone gray. 6 weeks. Alex, we can't afford hotel costs for 6 weeks, not with the medical bills. Extended stay hotels that handle insurance displacement run about $2,800 a month, I continued, pulling up my insurance app. Plus meals, since you won't have kitchen access. Figure another $800 minimum for food costs. Linda was staring at me with growing horror. $3,600 a month. For 2 months. That's $7,200 we don't have. Actually, I said, consulting my insurance policy details, my coverage includes tenant displacement costs up to 90 days. But there's a catch. What kind of catch? Sarah asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected. The insurance company requires documentation that the tenants were current on all obligations and that the landlord-tenant relationship was in good standing. I looked directly at Linda. They're going to review all communication records between tenants and property management. Every phone call, every email, every maintenance request. Linda's face went white as she realized what that meant. Janet keeps detailed notes on every interaction, Linda. Every time you called her incompetent, every time you screamed about response times, every complaint about your slumlord landlord. I set my phone on the table. Insurance companies love to deny claims based on hostile tenant relationships. You're saying they might not cover our displacement costs because I was rude to your property manager. Linda's voice was barely a whisper. I'm saying that insurance adjusters look for any excuse to minimize payouts. And a documented pattern of tenant hostility toward management gives them exactly the excuse they need. The bitter irony wasn't lost on anyone. Linda's months of taking out her frustrations on Janet Chin might have just cost her the safety net that would keep her family housed during the crisis. Uncle Bob leaned forward. Alex, surely you can work something out with the insurance company. I can try, I said slowly. But it would require Linda to personally call Janet tonight, explain the family relationship, and apologize for her previous behavior. Full disclosure, complete honesty, and hope that Janet's notes support a claim of resolved tenant relations. Linda stared at me across the table, finally understanding that her choices had consequences beyond hurt feelings and family drama. Or, I continued, you can stay here tonight while I figure out alternatives. But either way, Linda, your house is uninhabitable, and your safety net just became dependent on the same woman you've been treating like dirt for over a year. The phone in my hand buzzed with a text from Janet, water extraction team on site. Damage worse than initial assessment. Recommend full structural evaluation. I showed Linda the message, watching her realize that her Thanksgiving dinner had just become the least of her problems. The water damage turned out to be even worse than Janet's initial assessment. By midnight, we were looking at complete hardwood replacement, drywall reconstruction, and potential structural issues where water had seeped into the foundation. The insurance adjuster's preliminary estimate, $127,000 in repairs. But something had shifted during those tense hours of crisis management. Linda had called Janet at 9:15 p.m., her voice shaking as she introduced herself as Alex's mother-in-law and apologized for being difficult during what must have been stressful situations for everyone involved. Janet, to her credit, had been gracious and professional, even expressing concern for Linda's cancer treatments and offering to expedite the displacement hotel arrangements. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting across from Linda in a coffee shop near the extended stay hotel where she and Jim were temporarily living. She'd asked to meet, actually asked, no manipulation or guilt trips, to discuss something important. The medical bills, she said without preamble, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like it was an anchor. I need help with the medical bills. The words came out rushed, like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she didn't say them quickly. Okay, I said simply. How much help do you need? $38,462. She pulled out a manila folder, her movements precise and careful. I made a spreadsheet. Every treatment, every copay, every specialist visit for the next 18 months. I also included payment plan options from each provider, and calculated what we could realistically manage monthly with Jim's current client base. I stared at her, genuinely surprised. The woman who'd spent 4 years avoiding honest conversations about money had just handed me a comprehensive financial analysis. You've been working on this for a while, I observed. Since the night of Thanksgiving dinner. Since I realized that pride wasn't keeping us fed or housed. Linda's voice was steady now, more confident than I'd heard it in years. I also have a proposal. I'm listening. I want to work for you. Not charity, not family favors, actual employment. She pulled out another folder. I've been researching property management, tenant relations, market analysis for rental properties. I know I have no formal experience, but I understand people, I understand customer service, and I sure as hell understand what tenants need from their landlords. The proposal caught me completely off guard. Linda. Janet told me you've been handling too much personally. Midnight maintenance calls, tenant disputes, property inspections. She thinks you need someone to focus on tenant relations specifically, someone who can bridge the gap between corporate efficiency and human decency. I leaned back in my chair, processing this unexpected turn. What kind of salary are you thinking? $42,000 annually. Full-time, with health benefits that would cover my treatments and reduce our out-of-pocket costs to maybe $8,000 total. Linda's business-like tone wavered slightly. It would take me 11 months to earn enough to pay back the medical expenses. Fair trade for what I put you through. And Jim? Jim's business is picking up again. 3 new clients since November, and the Hendersons referred him to 2 other property owners in the neighborhood who need consulting work. A small smile tugged at her lips. Apparently, having a landlord who actually cares about his tenants is good for community relations. I studied Linda Morrison, my mother-in-law, my former problem tenant, and now my potential employee. The woman who'd spent 4 years calling me a deadbeat was offering to work for me to pay back money I hadn't even given her yet. When can you start? I asked. The relief that flooded her face was worth every moment of Thanksgiving night drama. Is Monday too soon?